Good morning, everybody. Welcome back to the class. Today, we will talk about the origin of bowel potential. As we all know that the basic unit of our human body is the cell, and every cell consists of the cell membrane, and the cell membrane carries the charge. So once the cell changes its membrane charge, then bowel potential can be generated. But not all the cells have the ability to change its membrane charge. Only the excitable cell have the ability, so we will discuss it later. And actually, all this kind of bowel potential can come from either the cells or the organ. As you all know that similar cells grouped together will form the tissue, and similar tissue groups together will form the organs. For example, the cardiac cell, the cardiac muscle cell groups together will form the cardiac tissue, and subcardiac tissue groups together will form the heart, and heart is the organ. So the heart, if it gives out the bowel potential, what we so-called the electrocardiogram, then it can let the physicians to know what is going on the heart. So the bowel potential actually can provide the medical physicians a lot of information, not just the physiological information, but also the clinical information. So bowel potential from the organs can provide clinical diagnostic significance. As I mentioned before, cell actually can provide bowel potential signal, but only the excitable cell, please remember. So what kind of cell can provide the bowel potential signal? For example, the neuron cell. If the neuron cell cannot generate the bowel potential, actually we can't move anymore. Other than the cell, we have a lot of organs inside our human body that can allow us to generate the bowel potential. For example, the heart. The heart, if it generates the bowel potential, what we so-called is the electrocardiogram. So, as we all know that as long as we are still alive, we all have the heart beating. Every heartbeat will generate the ECG signal. And the ECG signal normally have the ECG pattern that is the PQRST pattern. And so the medical physicians can use the ECG signals to diagnose whether the subject's heart is healthy or diseases. So what we can use from the ECG signal, we can use this to see whether the patient is suffering from heart attack or not. And even, for example, pacemaker. Pacemaker actually is a combination of two devices. One device is to monitor the ECG signal, and the other device is to give the electrical stimulation. So the device to monitor the ECG signal, and then under monitoring of its pattern, if it is abnormal, then it will activate the electrical stimulation to stimulate the heart. Okay, so another signal come from the other. Another bowel potential signal come from the other organ is the brain. So what we so-called that is the EEG. What we can use for the EEG is quite a lot. For example, we can use the EEGs to know whether a patient is suffering from epilepsy. As we all know that all the EEG signal from different kinds of the subject is different. There is almost no regular pattern. But for the patient who have epilepsy, they will have a regular patterns on their EEG. So that is the reason why the medical physicians can use the EEGs to see the severity of the patient suffering from the epilepsy. And other than that, we can also use the EEGs to know how much damage for the brain trauma. And other than that, we can also using EEGs to see whether a patient is totally deaf, brain deaf. Okay. Excuse me. If the bowel potential signal is come from the muscle, then we call it is the electromyogram, that is EMG signal. So how we can use it? We can use the EMG signals to diagnose the neuromuscular diseases. For example, to use the EMG signals to to evaluate cerebral palsy patient. Other than that, we can also use the EMG signals to control the prosthesis. What we so-called that kind of prosthesis is the mild prosthesis. So you can see that the virus potential signal, if it comes out from the cell or it comes out from the organ, it has a lot of application. So today, that is the reason why we need to focus on it. As I mentioned before, the basic unit of our human body is the cell, and the cell have a cell membrane. In front of you have a have a picture. It illustrates the cell membrane. You can see that it consists of lipid bilayer as well as the protein channel. So it will separate the outer part and the inner part. The outer part we call it as the extracellular part, and the inner part we call it as the intracellular part. So you can see that the lipid layer almost just look like a wall. It will block everything. Don't let the substance to go in and go out. But for the protein channel, it just looks like the window or the door. Once it opens, the substance can go in and go out. But once it closes, nothing can go in and go out as well. That's why it can control the ions to go in and go out, or some molecules to go in and go out. So right now, I will talk about why our human body can generate the power potential. So as I mentioned before, the basic unit of our human body is a cell. In front of you, let's say it is a cell. Okay, inside the cell membrane, we have a lot of ions, the cation and the anion. Let's say the cations, we have the sodium ions, the potassium ions, okay? And then we have various kinds of the anion. So outside the cell membranes, we also have iron as well, sodium ion, potassium ion, and chloride ion. So you can see that the concentrations of these kind of ions are different. So you can see there are very high concentrations of the sodium ion outside the cell membrane as compared to the sodium ion inside the cell membrane. Okay, but you can find that the potassium ion right now is high concentration inside the cell membrane as compared to the concentration outside the cell membrane. So right now we don't need to mention about the negative ions. So let's say right now we have all these kinds of cation, and outside the cell membrane, let's say we have 10 positive ion, but inside the cell membrane we have only 5 positive ion. So relatively, outside the cell membrane have a higher potential as compared to the potential inside the cell membrane. If we use a voltmeter to measure the voltage inside the cell membrane relative to the outside of the membrane, then because of this kind of positive ions imbalance, higher positive ion outside as compared to inside, that means that inside have a little bit relatively low potential as compared to the outside. So that is the reason why there's a negative charge inside as compared to the outer membrane, outside membrane. Okay. So right now I need to talk about how it will work. So let's say if this kind of cell, if you still remember, the cell membrane have the lipid bilayer as well as the protein channel. If let's say this time the channel for the sodium ion open because of the potential, because of the concentration difference, high concentration outside but lower concentration inside for sodium ion. So it means that because of the diffusion law, a lot of sodium ions will go into the cell membrane, inside the cell membrane. So right now, if you still remember what I mentioned before, if originally we have higher positive ion outside, but positive sodium ion outside, but high positive ions outside, but lesser positive ions inside. But because of the sodium ion rush go into inside the cell membrane, then right now inside the cell membrane have more positive ion as compared to the outside. then the cell membrane right now will become positive. So after what we so-called this is excited. So after excited, the gate for the potassium ion open. As you can see that the potassium ion inside the cell membrane have high concentration as compared to outside. Because of the concentration gradient, concentration will move from high concentrations to low concentration. That means that the potassium ions will move from inside to outside. So it means that the potassium ions will move from inside to outside, and the inside positive ions will become lower as compared to outside. So it means that the voltage will draw back. So right now I need to using a diagram here. To illustrate the action potential of the excitable cell. Okay, here in front of you, I will talk about, let's say if it is a neuron cell. If you still remember, if originally outside the cell membrane, we have a lot of sodium ion as compared to inside. Once the gate for sodium ions open, a lot of sodium ion will go into the cell membrane. So inside have high potential, outside have low potential. So the voltage will increase from negative 70 millivoltage to 90 millivoltage up to positive 30 millivoltage because of the movement of the sodium ion from outside the cell membrane into the inside the cell membrane. After excited, then the potassium ions will move from inside the cell membrane to outside of the cell membrane. So it means that right now the positive ion outside the cell membrane is more. So it will draw the voltage back to negative again, even much more negative. Okay, after that the sodium potassium pump will activate to ask the sodium ion go inside the cell membranes to go out, go back to outside, and ask the potassium ions go outside the cell membrane and come back to the cell membrane inside. Okay, so that is one action potential. Okay, so right now I will talk about the the cardio muscle. It means the heart. So actually it's exactly the same. Once the sodium channel open, a lot of sodium ion will go inside the cell membrane. So inside have high potential. So it means that the potential difference of the cell membrane will change from negative 70 millivoltage up to plus 30 millivoltage. Then after excited, the calcium channels will also open. So it will let the calcium ions move into the inside the cell membrane of the cardio cell. So it will try to maintain at the excited state. And after that, the channel for the potassium ions will open, and it will let the potassium ions to move out of the cell membrane. So it will draw the potential difference of the cell membrane back to minus 70 millivoltage, and after that sodium potassium pump will be activated. Of course, once we ask the sodium potassium pump to activate it, it means that it needs to use up the energy, energy to activate the pump. So it will ask the sodium ions to go out again and potassium ions to go back to the cell membrane again. Okay, so that is the mechanism for the for the generation of the action potential from cell, let's say neuron, or even from a organ like the cardio muscle. Remember, the muscle and the neuron will have this very sharp action potential like this without the contribution of the calcium ion on the generation of this action potential. But the action potential for the cardio muscle will be look like this. It involves the the contributions of the calcium ions to maintain the action potential at the excited state for a while. So right now, we will have a look. We will watch a video to talk about how the action potential is being generated in a neuron. So let's have a look on the video right now.
Neurons communicate with each other through their dendrites and axon. Generally, incoming signals are received at dendrites, while outgoing signals travel along the axon to the nerve terminal. In order to achieve rapid communication over its long axon, the neuron sends electrical signals from the cell's body to the nerve terminal along the axon. These are known as nerve impulses or action potentials. An action potential is essentially a brief reversal of electric polarity across the cell membrane. Cells are polarized, meaning there is an electrical voltage across the cell membrane. In a resting neuron, the typical voltage, known as the resting membrane potential, is about -70 millivolts. The negative value means the cell is more negative on the inside. At this resting state, there are concentration gradients of sodium and potassium across the cell membrane. More sodium outside the cell and more potassium inside the cell. These gradients are maintained by the sodium-potassium pump, which constantly brings potassium in and pumps sodium out of the cell. A neuron is typically stimulated at dendrites, and the signals spread through the soma. Excitatory signals at dendrites open ligand-gated sodium channels and allow sodium to flow into the cell. This neutralizes some of the negative charge inside the cell and makes the membrane voltage less negative. This is known as depolarization, as the cell membrane becomes less polarized. The influx of sodium diffuses inside the neuron and produces a current that travels towards the axon hillock. If the summation of all input signals is excitatory and is strong enough when it reaches the axon hillock, an action potential is generated and travels down the axon to the nerve terminal. The axon hillock is also known as the cell's trigger zone, as this is where action potentials usually start. This is because action potentials are produced by voltage-gated ion channels that are most concentrated at the axon hillock. Voltage-gated ion channels are passageways for ions in and out of the cell, and as their name suggests, are regulated by membrane voltage. They open at some values of the membrane potential and close at others. For an action potential to be generated, the signal must be strong enough to bring the membrane voltage to a critical value called the threshold, typically about -55 millivolts. This is the minimum required to open voltage-gated ion channels. At threshold, sodium channels open quickly. Potassium channels also open, but do so more slowly. The initial effect is therefore due to sodium influx. As sodium ions rush into the cell, the inside of the cell becomes more positive, and this further depolarizes the cell membrane. The increasing voltage in turn causes even more sodium channels to open. This positive feedback continues until all the sodium channels are open and corresponds to the rising phase of the action potential. Note that the polarity across the cell membrane is now reversed. As the action potential nears its peak, sodium channels begin to close. By this time, the slow potassium channels are fully open. Potassium ions rush out of the cell, and the voltage quickly returns to its original resting value. This corresponds to the falling phase of the action potential. Note that sodium and potassium have now switched places across the membrane. As the potassium gates are also slow to close, potassium continues to leave the cell a little longer, resulting in a negative overshoot called hyperpolarization. The resting membrane potential is then slowly restored thanks to diffusion and the sodium-potassium pump. During and shortly after an action potential is generated, it is impossible or very difficult to stimulate that part of the membrane to fire again. This is known as the refractory period. The refractory period is divided into absolute refractory and relative refractory. The absolute refractory period lasts from the start of an action potential to the point the voltage first returns to the resting membrane value. During this time, the sodium channels are open and subsequently inactivated while closing and thus unable to respond to any new stimulation. The relative refractory period lasts until the end of hyperpolarization. During this time, some of the potassium channels are still open, making it difficult for the membrane to depolarize, and a much stronger signal is required to induce a new response. During an action potential, the sodium influx at a point on the axon spreads along the axon, depolarizing the adjacent patch of the membrane, generating a similar action potential in it. The sodium currents diffuse in both directions on the axon, but the refractory properties...
So I think that is enough for the videos to talk about how to generate the action potential of a neuron. Okay, it taught more than, it explains more than enough, because it even explains the relative refractory period as well as the absolute refractory period, and we will discuss this later. So right now you know that once the sodium ion move into the cell membrane, move inside the cell membrane, the potential of the cell membrane will rise up from negative 70 millivoltage up to positive 30 millivoltage. And once the potassium ion move out of the cell membrane, the potential of the cell membrane will drop back to minus 70 and even much lower, maybe minus 90 millivoltage, and the sodium potassium pump still keep working, and then let the ions to go in and go out and keep it back to the normal situation. So let me carry on my slide. And right now I need to talk about how the action potential being generated on the cardio muscle. If you still remember, I mentioned it before, the action potential generated in neuron is similar to the action potential generated in muscle. They have a very sharp peak on the action potential, but it's totally different from the action potential generated by the cardio muscle. So right now, let us have a look on the action potential generated by the cardio muscle.
The heart is essentially a muscle that contracts and pumps blood. It consists of specialized muscle cells called cardiac myocytes. The contraction of these cells is initiated by electrical impulses known as action potentials. Unlike skeletal muscles, which have to be stimulated by the nervous system, the heart generates its own electrical stimulation. In fact, a heart can keep on beating even when taken out of the body. The nervous system can make the heartbeats go faster or slower, but cannot generate them. The impulses start from a small group of myocytes called the pacemaker cells, which constitute the cardiac conduction system. These are modified myocytes that lose the ability to contract and become specialized for initiating and conducting action potentials. The SA node is the primary pacemaker of the heart. It initiates all heartbeats and controls heart rate. If the SA node is damaged, other parts of the conduction system may take over this role. The cells of the SA node fire spontaneously, generating action potentials that spread through the contractile myocytes of the atria. The myocytes are connected by gap junctions, which form channels that allow ions to flow from one cell to another. This enables electrical coupling of neighboring cells. An action potential in one cell triggers another action potential in its neighbor, and the signals propagate rapidly. The impulses reach the AV node, slow down a little to allow the atria to contract, then follow the conduction pathway and spread through the ventricular myocytes. Action potential generation and conduction are essential for all myocytes to act in synchrony. Pacemaker cells and contractile myocytes exhibit different forms of action potentials. Cells are polarized, meaning there is an electrical voltage across the cell membrane. In a resting cell, the membrane voltage, known as the resting membrane potential, is usually negative. This means the cell is more negative on the inside. At this resting state, there are concentration gradients of several ions across the cell membrane, more sodium and calcium outside the cell, and more potassium inside the cell. These gradients are maintained by several pumps that bring sodium and calcium out and potassium in. An action potential is essentially a brief reversal of electric polarity of the cell membrane and is produced by voltage-gated ion channels. These channels are passageways for ions in and out of the cell, and as their names suggest, are regulated by membrane voltage. They open at some values of membrane potential and close at others. When membrane voltage increases and becomes less negative, the cell is less polarized and is said to be depolarized. Reversely, when membrane potential becomes more negative, the cell is repolarized. For an action potential to be generated, the membrane voltage must depolarize to a critical value called the threshold. The pacemaker cells of the SA node spontaneously fire about 80 action potentials per minute, each of which sets off a heartbeat, resulting in an average heart rate of 80 beats per minute. Pacemaker cells do not have a true resting potential. The voltage starts at about -60 millivolts and spontaneously moves upward until it reaches the threshold of -40 millivolts. This is due to action of so-called funny currents, present only in pacemaker cells. Funny channels open when membrane voltage becomes lower than -40 millivolts and allow slow influx of sodium. The resulting depolarization is known as pacemaker potential. At threshold, calcium channels open, calcium ions flow into the cell, further depolarizing the membrane. This results in the rising phase of the action potential. At the peak of depolarization, potassium channels open, calcium channels inactivate, potassium ions leave the cell, and the voltage returns to -60 millivolts. This corresponds to the falling phase of the action potential. The original ionic gradients are restored thanks to several ionic pumps, and the cycle starts over. Electrical impulses from the SA node spread through the conduction system into the contractile myocytes. These myocytes have a different set of ion channels. In addition, their sarcoplasmic reticulum, the SR, stores a large amount of calcium. They also contain myofibrils. The contractile cells have a stable resting potential of -90 millivolts and depolarize only when stimulated, usually by a neighboring myocyte. When a cell is depolarized, it has more sodium and calcium inside the cell. These positive ions leak through the gap junctions to the adjacent cell and bring the membrane voltage of this cell up to the threshold of -70 millivolts. At threshold, fast sodium channels open, creating a rapid sodium influx and a sharp rise in voltage. This is the depolarizing phase. L-type or slow calcium channels also open at -40 millivolts, causing a slow but steady influx. As the action potential nears its peak, sodium channels close quickly, voltage-gated potassium channels open, and these result in a small decrease in membrane potential, known as early repolarization phase. The calcium channels, however, remain open, and the potassium efflux is eventually balanced by the calcium influx. This keeps the membrane potential relatively stable for about 200 milliseconds, resulting in the plateau phase, characteristic of cardiac action potentials. Calcium is crucial in coupling electrical excitation to physical muscle contraction. The influx of calcium from the extracellular fluid, however, is not enough to induce contraction. Instead, it triggers a much greater calcium release from the SR in a process known as calcium-induced calcium release. Calcium then sets off muscle contraction by the same sliding filament mechanism described for skeletal muscle. The contraction starts about halfway through the plateau phase and lasts till the end of this phase. As calcium channels slowly close, potassium efflux predominates and membrane voltage returns to its resting value. Calcium is actively transported out of the cell and also back to the SR. The sodium-potassium pump then restores the ionic balance across the membrane. Because of the plateau phase, cardiac muscle stays contracted longer than skeletal muscle. This is necessary for expulsion of blood from the heart chambers. The absolute refractory period is also much longer, 250 milliseconds compared to 1 millisecond in skeletal muscle. This long refractory period is to make sure the muscle has relaxed before it can respond to a new stimulus, and is essential in preventing summation and tetanus, which would stop the heart from beating. Thank you for watching. Please feel
So right now, you know how the action potential being generated in cardiac muscle. As you can see from the video, the cardiac muscle actually, so we say like that, the heart will how to say generate the nerve impulse by itself at the SA sinoatrial node. So because the sinoatrial node is just look like the neuron cell, so that is the reason why it still generate the action potential look like the neuron. Lots of sodium ions go in, so that the action potential will go from negative to positive, and then a lot of potassium ions go out, so it will drop back. But after the how to say action potential generated by the SA node, very sharp, look like the action potential generated at the neuron, then the action potential generate for the neighbor for its neighbor, let's say the contractile myocyte, it will increase the calcium ion. It will increase the calcium ion. So that is the reason why it will have the plateau. Okay. So right now, all of you understand why our human cell can generate the action potential. But remember, not all the human cell can generate the action potential. Only the excitable cell. So the excitable cell can be either the neuron, the muscle, or the cardio cell. Okay, these three different types. So and also right now you know what is resting potential. Resting potential means that if nothing all the cell, if it is at the resting state, it will have a potential, and that potential is at a range of minus 70 millivoltage. Okay, and after the cell is being stimulated, what we so called the gate for the sodium is open, then the cell is being activated. So once it is activated, the cell, as long as the action potential going up pass through the how to say threshold, then it will continuously to let the sodium ions to go into the cell, into the cell, then to continue the generations of the action potential. That is the reason why at the active state there is all or none theory. What does it mean? It means that either the cell will give you the action potential or they don't give you the action potential. The all or none is based on the threshold. The threshold is normally at about of minus 50 millivolts. Once the action potential passes through the minus 55 millivolts, then it will continue to generate the action potential. It will not stop. But once the action potential cannot reach minus 55 millivoltage, so it means that the action potentials will not be generated for the excitable cell. So here is just a diagram to explain all the video we have all the two video we have watched we have watched before. So in front of you is the cell. In front of you is the cell, and the cell have a lot of ions inside and outside. As we still remember, a lot of sodium ions outside, but a lot of potassium ions inside. If we try to measure the potential inside the cell membrane relative to outside, we will measure a minus 70 millivoltage. Okay. So as we all know that at the resting stage, the membrane, which is much more permeable. How much permeable? 50 to 100 times more permeable to potassium ions than the potassium ions. That is the reason why the resting potentials will be maintained at around minus 70 to minus 90 millivoltage. Okay. So here is just the diagram to let you see the basic unit of the human body is the cell, and the cell consists of the cell membrane. Here have the cell membrane, have the lipid bilayer and the protein channel. If the gate let's say if the gate is opened, then the ions can go in and out. But if the gate is closed, then the ions will not go in and out, which is blocked. And this gate can be a chemically controlled or either voltage controlled. For the voltage controlled gate, it will respond very fast, but just for a short period of time. For the chemically controlled gate, it will respond slowly, but it will sustain for a longer time. So this diagram tries to illustrate how the action potential is generated. In front of you is the cell membrane. Here is the lipid bilayer, and let's say this is the protein channel. So outside the cell membrane, we have a lot of sodium ion, but inside the cell membrane, we just have very less amount of sodium ion. But vice versa for the potassium ion. Okay, so because of this ion imbalance, that is the reason why inside the cell membrane we have minus 70 up to minus 90 millivoltage voltage. Okay, so once the cell membrane is stimulated, a lot of sodium ions will go inside the cell membrane. So the voltage will go up from minus 90 millivoltage up to plus 30 millivoltage. Okay, and after that, what we so called that is depolarization. Okay, we need to remember this word, the depolarization. Okay, so after that, potassium ion move out of the cell membrane, and so this process we call it as the repolarization. Okay, the voltage will come back from positive millivoltage back to minus 90 millivoltage. After that, the sodium potassium pump keep working and ask, let's say they will use one unit of the ATP. They will ask 3 units of the sodium ions to go out, and then 2 units of the potassium ions to go in, so to make it back to the resting state again. Okay, so here is the diagrams to illustrate different phase what will happen for the cell membrane. At the resting phase, both the gates for the sodium ions and the potassium ions will close. That means that inside the cell membrane will carry negative charge as compared to outside. Okay, so that is the reason why we have the resting potential here. But after we stimulate the cell membrane, the sodium gate will open. A lot of sodium ions will move inside the cell membrane, and what we so call this process is depolarization. So it means that sodium ion influx inside the cell have depolarization and make the cell membrane change from minus 30 to 90 millivoltage up to positive 30 millivoltage. And after that, the sodium gate close and the potassium gate open. So a lot of potassium ion will move out of the cell. So the potential will drop back from positive millivoltage back to minus 70 millivoltage. And this process, what we so call is the repolarization. Even the potassium channel will further opens to let the potassium ions to go out, and this process we call this phase we call it as the undershoot phase. Okay, undershoot phase. So if you still remember one of the video you watched before is which tell us how to generate the action potential on neuron or on the cardiac muscle. It mentioned about the refractory period. Okay, so let me see. So we can just simply skip on this one because it's not that important, because the most important is the refractory period. Okay, so as you remember, you need to remember that the refractory period we will have the absolute refractory period as well as the relative refractory period. Let's say right now in front of you have the action potential generated by the nerve. So let us have a look on this curve. When the sodium ion influx inside into the cell, the action potential will go up. Okay, and then what we so called this is the depolarization. And once the potassium channel, once the potassium channel open, then a lot of potassium ions will go out of the cell, and then the action potential will drop at. So we call it is the repolarization. Normally, the time for the repolarization in repolarization for the nerve and muscle is around of 1 to 5 millivoltage. Okay, 1 to 5 milliseconds. So how about for the heart muscle, cardio muscle? For the cardio muscle, it will be about of 150 up to 300 milliseconds. So let us have a look. So during the period on these two color, so it means that within this period of time, we will so-called that period as the absolute refractory period. And after this time domain, after this time slot, the action potential will go into the relative refractory period. What does it mean for the absolute refractory period? If the action potential is at the absolute refractory period, it means that no matter how we try to further stimulate the cell, it will not generate another action potential. But during the relative refractory period, let's say if here we try to give a stimulation on the cell again, and the stimulus is strong enough, so another action potential will be generated, and no need to wait until it is fully back to the resting potential. So here is the definition for the absolute refractory period. It means that it cannot stimulate the cell to generate an action potential. Okay, but for the relative refractory period, it can be stimulated again to generate another action potential if the stimulus is stronger than normal. Okay, so right now I will talk about how the action potential is propagated. Okay, so let me see here. Okay, so you can see here, we can see, let's say in front of you is the nerve. Okay, if you still remember, inside the cell membrane is negative potential, and outside the cell membrane is the positive potential. Once the cell membrane is activated, stimulus, so a lot of sodium ions will go inside the cell membrane, and then regionally, this part inside will become positive, but its neighbor is still negative. So that is the reason why positive, negative, it will form a complete circuit. That is the reason why the signal can be transmitted. Okay. So right now, let us have a look on how the action potential is propagated on the nerve cell. Okay. So let us have a look here.
I've said before that a nerve impulse is an electrical signal that travels along the neuron, but it's not quite electricity as you may know it. Electricity is the flow of electrons, but in a nerve impulse we use the word potential to describe the movement of charged particles across the membrane of a cell. The charged particles flow like a wave down the axon, moving in and out of the cell. The movement is mostly of positively charged ions, not negatively charged electrons like you might imagine. Let's look even closer at the cell membrane. At rest, when a neuron isn't firing, there's a high concentration of sodium ions outside of the cell membrane, and also a high concentration of potassium ions in the cytosol of the cell. The sodium and potassium channels are gated and closed. Because of the difference in number of sodium and potassium ions, as well as the presence of negative ions like chlorine, there's an overall negative internal charge of negative 70 millivolts. The beginning of an impulse is marked by depolarization. This means that the voltage-gated sodium channel is opened and the sodium rushes into the cell. The influx of positive charges quickly shifts the electric potential of the membrane, so that now the outside is more negative and the inside of the cell is more positive. This change in polarity will close the sodium gate. Nearby is the voltage-gated potassium channel, which will now open and allow potassium ions to flow out of the cell. The movement of these positive ions will repolarize the cell, allowing the cell to have a negative internal charge relative to the positive extracellular charge. The change in polarity will also close the potassium gate. At this time, you might think that the cell is ready to receive another signal, but it can't. If the sodium gates opened, the sodium ions would not move. In order for ions to move through their channels, they have to be able to move down the electrochemical gradient. The positive sodium ions aren't attracted to the positive environment outside of the cell, so they won't move. Another signal can't be sent until the sodium and potassium ions have moved back to their resting potential positions. But this means moving against concentration gradients, which means energy must be used. During the refractory period, the sodium-potassium pump will move 3 sodium ions out of the cell and 2 potassium ions into the cell with 1 ATP molecule. This must happen constantly and rapidly, so the brain uses a significant amount of your body's energy. In a matter of milliseconds, the sodium-potassium pumps will restore resting potential and another action potential can move through. Nerve impulses are actually waves of action potentials, which means ions are flowing in and out of the cell in a wave-like pattern. Because of the refractory period where sodium ions will not flow out of the cell by diffusion, action potentials can only move in one direction. They begin at the dendrites and they end at the axon terminals. This wave-like region where the action potentials are flowing are referred to as the local current. The flow of sodium through one gate will trigger the flow of sodium in the next gate, but sometimes there isn't enough sodium to trigger an action potential. Using an oscilloscope to display the membrane potential over time, we can see that sometimes the flow of sodium ions isn't enough for an action potential to occur. The internal region of the cell must reach negative 55 millivolts, the threshold potential, for action potentials to begin. If enough sodium ions are released to surpass the threshold potential, an action potential occurs. In the oscilloscope trace of an action potential, we can see where the sodium and potassium gates have opened. Here is the point where the stimulus occurs, and sodium gates open, allowing sodium to rush into the cell. This depolarizes the cell, causing the inside to become positive relative to the outside of the cell. This polarity change opens the potassium gate, which allows potassium ions to rush out of the cell, which rapidly repolarizes the inside to a negative charge. This can often become more negative than negative 70 millivolts and is called hyperpolarization or undershoot. This will be corrected during the refractory period, where the sodium-potassium pump uses ATP to restore resting potential. During this time, no additional action potentials can be sent, but once resting potential is reached, the neuron is ready to fire again. Thanks for watching this episode of Teacher's Pet.
So right now, you know how the action potential is being propagated along the Earth is from remember, it is in one direction. Okay. So myelinated and unmyelinated fibers. So if the nerve is unmyelinated, then the action potential moving is just very slowly. But if for a myelinated fiber, the action potential change will jump from loop to loop. Okay, so here is the diagram to illustrate why all the nerve fiber is myelinated rather than the unmyelinated. So on the left-hand side is the unmyelinated nerve fiber. So at 1 millisecond, the sodium ion, let's say at 1 millisecond, the sodium ion channel opened and then the action potential is changed from negative 70 millivoltage up to 30 millivoltage because of its neighbor is still negative, so that so that the neighbor will be stimulated and then the signal is propagated from left to right. So after 10 milliseconds and then the pulse, the stimulation is just moved from this position to this location. Okay, this location. But how about for myelinated fibers? So let's say at the same time we try to stimulate myelinated nerve fiber, and then after 10 minutes, because the stimulation is strong from loop to loop. Okay, so after 10 milliseconds, it's moved for a longer distance. That is very important for nerve, because for the nerve fiber, they need to transmit as fast as possible. Okay. So here, try to illustrate the action potential of different excitable cells. In front of you have three different kinds of action potential. The first one is the action potential being generated by neuron. It will have the pulse wave of about 1 to 3 milliseconds, and this is the action potential, including the influx of the sodium ion depolarization, what we so-called, and the outflux of the potassium ion, what we so-called is the repolarization. The same for the skeletal muscle, but the pulse width for the skeletal muscle will be much wilder. It is around of 3 to 5 milliseconds. Okay, also includes the depolarization for the influx of the sodium ion, and repolarization, the outflux of the potassium ion. So how about for the cardiac muscle? Its pulse width will be around of 150 milliseconds up to 300 milliseconds. In average, it's around 200 milliseconds. Okay, so the same, it will include the depolarization, that is the influx of the sodium ion, and then still let the calcium ions to keep going to move inside the cell membrane, so that it will have a plug here, and then the repolarization, that is the outflux of the potassium ion. Okay, so for this slide, I just want to let you know that different action potential generated from different excitable cells will have different pulse width. Okay, so right now I will talk about how important is the refractory period. Okay, let us have a look on the skeletal cell, first. So this red line represents the action potential, and this blue line represents the the muscle contraction. So let's say this triangle represents for the stimulus. Once we have the stimulus, a action potential will be generated for the skeletal muscle. Do you still remember the process? Depolarization and repolarization, sodium influx, potassium outflux. After we have one action potential, of course, we will have one muscle fiber contraction. Okay, so if we have, right now, let us have a look. If we not just give one stimulus, but we give a lot of stimulation in a short period of time. So if you still remember, if that stimulus is on the relatively refractory period, what does it mean? It means that the muscle contraction not back to the 0 Newton, but we will have another action potential. It will generate another muscle contraction. That means that the muscle force, the muscle tension will be accumulated. But no matter how we try to stimulate on the muscle fiber, once it reaches its maximum tension, it will not be increase its muscle tension anymore, because the muscle tension depends on the amount of the muscle fibers. Okay, so right now I will talk about the cardio muscle. So let's say if we have a stimulus here, and then once we stimulate the cardio cell, the sodium ions will go inside the cell, and the calcium ions will go inside the cell, and the potassium ion go outside the cell. Okay, here. So of course it will generate one cardio muscle contraction. So this region is the absolute refractory period. So what's the importance of the absolute refractory period? So you can see from this diagram. Let's say if we have a lot of stimulus. So during this refractory period, that is the absolute refractory period, it will not generate another action potential. So what does it mean? It means that the muscle will finish its contraction and relaxation during this period of time. But during this period of time, that is not the refractory period, then if we have another stimulus here, then it will generate another action potential, of course, it will result in another, cardio muscle contraction. This try to prevent the situation of the cardio muscle look like the skeletal muscle. If our cardio muscle look like this, it means that our cardio muscle will not release. But it is impossible because our heart needs to have the pumping effect. Contraction, relaxation, so that the blood can go out of the heart to form the circulation. That's why the importance that this shows the importance of the refractive periods in the cardio muscle. So right now, let us take 10 minutes break, and then we will talk about the application of this kind of biopotential. In the previous lessons, we mentioned how our muscle, how our excitable cell can generate the biopotential. Right now, I will talk about after 10 minutes break, then I will talk about how we can use the biopotential for some application. So let us take 10 minutes break right now. Okay, so welcome back. Welcome back. We will talk about right now. We will talk about how we try to use the biopotential for some clinical application. As we all know that sometimes the nerves will be deteriorated or injured. So how we can know whether the nerve conduction is okay or not? Then we can use the electroneurogram. What we so-called is the ENG. Okay, so we have two sets of the electrode here. Okay, with a fixed distance. After we use the electrical stimulation to stimulate these two distance on the same nerve, then the stimulus will move along the nerve fiber and reach the muscle. Once the muscle receives this stimulation, it will form the EMG signal. As we know that the closer the stimulation to the muscle, the faster it will result the first muscle contraction. So it means that the S2 will reach the muscle first, followed by the S1 stimulus. So how we can calculate the nerve conduction? We have a distance here, and then we have the time difference between these two stimulus arrived on the muscle. Then, according to the physics we learned, velocity is equal to distance divided by what? Time. Then we can know it. So the clinical values for this kind of nerve conduction velocity is to see how much the nerve fiber is regenerated after the nerve injury. Okay, so here has a video. We can have a look on the median motor nerve conduction study. Let us have a look on this one.
Right median motor nerve conduction study. So, first thing.
Wait. So let us have a look. Sorry. So it's okay.
What we're going to do is measure 8 centimeters from the APB muscle. So I'm going to make a mark right in the center of the muscle. I'm going to go through the course of the nerve, through the carpal tunnel, to 8 centimeters. Make a little mark right there by the 8. Okay. Next thing, I'm going to place my electrodes. I'm going to put one right there on the middle of the muscle. One by the second digit, and the ground is going to go on the back of the hand. We'll hook up our leads. Red, the black one. Make sure this is right in the center of that muscle, and the green one on the back. The machine is on, here you see our levels at 30 milliamps. That's usually a good starting intensity for motor nerve. We're going to measure our distance here is 80 for the 8 centimeters. It's in millimeters. And we're going to stimulate right there. We put our black toward the black. And shuck. I didn't find it, so I'm going to adjust slightly.
So you see, after the people give the stimulation, his fingers is
so now we've added
thickening.
at 30, and we see our amplitude here. Our amplitude corresponds with the height of the peak here. We're going to turn that up to about 45, and then hit it again and see if we can get a higher amplitude. And it didn't move. We were at 5.7, and we stayed at 5.7. So that's probably as high as we're going to get with Patty. So we can even turn that down a little bit, go back to somewhere in between. And now we're going to go up, hit our down arrow here. We're going to go and test this nerve at the elbow. So the median nerve you'll find just medial to midline. We're going to again put the black in the crease, bend her arm slightly so we can get it down in there on top of the nerve, and hit it again.
It will
and that's pretty
move
good.
a
I'm going
lot.
to turn the level up just slightly. We see an amplitude of 5.7. It went to 5.3. It's pretty darn close. The area under the curve also is pretty close. But I'm going to try with a little higher intensity, see if we can get an even better amplitude.
Okay, you can see the time gap.
And
Okay.
it didn't change.
So that's maybe enough for all of you. If you are interested in it, you can just watch these videos by yourself, because I don't want to waste too much time on watching all this kind of application. Okay. So let us carry on. So of course, we can also use it for the sensory nerve action potential. So let's say if we try to give a stimulation on fingers and measure the signal at the wrist region as well as the elbow regions, you will find that the potential at the wrist is of much larger magnitude than the delayed potential recorded at the elbow. Do you know why? This is because the median nerve to be of the same size and shape at the elbow as at the wrist. The difference is due to the size of the volume conductor at each location and the radiant distance of the measure point from the nerve sources. So right now, we also know that we can using the sensory nerve action potentials to know about our reflex action as well. We try to stimulate the nerve at the back and then measure the biopotential signal. Here you will see all this kind of pattern, and you will find that this one represents for the spinal reflex, and this one will represent for the muscular reflex. You will find that after we have the stimulation, of course, the first signal we get definitely is the spinal, because it's much faster. It looked at the spinal cord there, and after a while, the spinal reflex signal will be small, and then the muscular response signal will come out, and after a period of time, the spinal muscle signal will become almost flattened, but the muscular response signals will become very high. Okay, so I have a video to let you have a look on that.
Okay, the last nerve conduction in the lower extremity is the H reflex. And the H reflex, we're going to stimulate at the knee right here. In fact, we're going to stimulate the tibial nerve at the knee, and we're going to record from the calf muscles right here. So basically, in order for me to find out where to put the active electrode for the calf muscle, I ask the subject to flex their knee as though they're pressing on the gas pedal. So push down on my hand as I press on the gas pedal, and you can feel the hole here, which is the inverted V between the lateral and medial gastrocnemius muscle, and that's where I will put my active black electrode, And as usual, the reference electrode is going to be below it, right there. And then the green ground electrode is going to be somewhere here. And now I can put the cream, and I'm going to stimulate the tibial nerve right here at the knee. And again, these nerves are deep, so I usually have to use higher stimulation intensity. And here we go. I'm going to start. But you don't have to go very high here because you can get the H reflex much sooner and much faster than you can get an F wave. So I start like at 8 or 9. I don't go much higher at that point. And you will see a wave developing right here. Here we go, and I got it like right away.
Too.
Here we go,
This is
and
the
I'm going to
reflex,
store
this
that.
muscular.
So that's the H reflex, and that's the motor nerve before it. And that's a great H reflex. I'm going to give it another stimulation right here. And also that's a great H reflex, so I'm going to store it right there. And those are great H reflexes. And you'll notice that the computer placed the cursors in the right place. So that's the latency of the H reflex, that's the amplitude, and that's where the potential finishes, essentially. And that's the H reflex. Now, normally, we do the H reflex on both.
Okay. So that is how we can use the power potential signals to know about the H reflex. So for the EMG signal, why we have the EMG signal? EMG signal is come from the muscle cell. So as we all know that humans have the ability to control the muscle movement. Why we can control the muscle movement? Because the brain cell generate the signal. So the power potential signal will pass through the nerve. Of course, the nerve also generates the power potential signal and transmit and arrive to the muscle fiber. Of course, the muscle fiber will generate the power potential signal as well. The power potential signal generated from the muscle cell is called the EMG signal, electromyograph. Okay, so normally, if you still remember the pulse width of the axial potential of the the power potential, the pulse width of the power potential signal of the skeletal muscle is at around 3 to 5 milliseconds, but its amplitude is quite high because normally we will have a lot of muscle layer. So normally it can the amplitude will be ranged from 20 up to 2,000 millivoltage. Normally the frequency of the discharge will vary from 6 to 30 times per second. Okay, so you will see that this one is very clean, this one is very rush. If you're using the needle electrode, then it will be much more clear EMG signal you can get it. If you're using the surface electrode, probably you will get the signal look like this. Okay, so right now I will talk about how we can use the power potential signal from our muscles to control the robotic arm. Okay, let us have a look.
Driving down the road, I had my arm laid over on the window of my automobile. Next thing you know, the state police was pulling me over. They said, "We need to see your hand." I said, "Well, I'm without one hand." I said, "You know, I'm amputee." So I stuck my hand out like this. He said, "Put that gun down." I said, "Well, this is not a gun. Come up and inspect." I said, "You can see, there's both hands. I can't do anything else." I said, "What it is, it's the newest thing in prosthetic. This is an implant." They said, "Well, do us a favor. Just don't put your arm out the window until you get your prosthetic on there." So we got more things to do than keep pulling you over. I used to be a salesman, and 2000.
So you can see that this is the electrodes to collect the EMG signal. Once it collected, then it will try to be analyzed by the MCU microcontroller units to control all the motor of the electric arm. You can see that.
You don't think that doesn't make me happy and give me that much more of a drive? Yes, it does.
Ready and go. Hold it, hold it, hold it, hold it, and relax.
So this is
Johnny
the sensor
Matheny has
to
become
capture
something
the
of a guinea
EMG
pig for
signal.
experimental
Okay,
prosthetics.
so I think that is enough
Hand
for
open.
you. So you can see that even for
What he's testing
people who
here
lost their
being the
arm,
Johns Hopkins Applied Physics Laboratory.
if we have fully utilized the signal generated from the muscle, we can still also using these kind of signals to control the robotic arm. Okay. So right now I'll talk about the ECG signal. ECG signal actually is the biopotential signal come from the heart. So it is a kind of non-invasive, techniques to know the physiological function or the physiological function of the heart. So that's why it is a very good diagnostic tool for medical physicians to know the conditions of the heart. Before we start to know what is ECG, we need to know a little bit about our heart anatomy. So the heart consists of 4 chambers, okay, 2 atrium and 2 ventricles. The left ventricle will be a little bit bigger as compared to the right ventricle. This is because the left ventricles will try to, give the force for the main circulation, okay, and the right ventricle will give the force for the pulmonary circulation. Okay, so that I think that is maybe enough for all of you. So at this region, top right hand corner here, we will have the SA note here, we have the AV note here, okay, etc. and etc. We will discuss this later. If you still remember what I mentioned before, the action potential generated by the cardiac muscle will look like this: sodium influx, potassium influx, and calcium influx. Okay, so in total it will be around 150 up to 300 milliseconds for its pulse width. So you can see that different channel for such ion is open. That's why the potential will change accordingly. So right now I need to talk about the conduction system of the heart. If you still remember, there's one video we watched before, and it said that our heart will generate the heart beating by themselves. It means that our heart beating cannot be controlled by our brain. We can ask our heart to stop from our brain. This is because they have the brain, they have their commander inside their heart. It's at this region, atrial node. It is the brain of the heart here. Okay, it will try to give what we so-called actually is a pacemaker. It will give a stimulation out starting from this point and then through the internal conductive fiber to reach both atrium. And after they reach both atrium, of course, the atrium will contract. And after that, the signal will gather together at this AV node. The AV node actually, you can just think it is a buffer. So it will keep the signal here for a while. It will form a buffer. It will delay a little. Then, because you see, this is short distance. Of course, it will arrive first. This is long distance. It will arrive later. If first come, first go, then it means that the heart, both atrium and the ventricle will contract at the same time. That's why the AV node played a role as a buffer. Once the signal arrived at the AV node, they will stay here for a while. Okay, and after that, it will pass through the bundle of His and Purkinje fiber. For the signal pass through the bundle of His, it will pass through so fast, very, very fast. But for the signal pass through the Purkinje fiber from the bottom to up here, it will slowly to pass through it. So once it passes through it like this, from the bottom to the top, it will make the ventricle to contract from the bottom to the top, so that the breath will not retain at the ventricle and give out and go out of the heart. So here is just try to let you know that if here is the cardio cell, and then if we have if we have a oscilloscope to measure the potential the potential here. So let's say if we try to measure the potential here, it will have this VAC graph here. But right now we try to measure it like this because we reversed the position here already. So that's why it is upside down. But But right now, if we try to measure AB here, so we have VAB look like this. Okay, so AB here, CB here. We try to measure it look like this. It means that we try to subtract this one with this one subtract with this one, so it will form like this. But because all of us will have the PQRST pattern, not like this but like this, it means that this part needs to be higher and this part needs to be smaller, so that it will look like this PQRST pattern. Later we will talk about it. So remember, when the starting point of the heart beating is from the SA node. Once it gives a signal out from the SA, the remaining part of the heart is still not working. But after it stimulates its neighbor and then through the internal conducting fiber, then the atriums will contract. Once it arrives the AV node, it will stimulate the AV. Okay. So the AV is also look like the neuron. That is the reason why it will have sodium in and potassium out, the same as the SA nodes, but not for the atrium and the ventricle. Okay, for the Purkinje fiber, as far as the ventricle is contractions will look like this. So at different times, the signals will be at different positions. So we try to, at this time slot, we add this voltage with this voltage, with this voltage, and with all this voltage, we have this one resultant voltage here. So that is the reason why, as long as we're still alive, then all the people will have this ECG pattern, PQRST pattern. Okay, the P wave represents for the atrium contraction, QRS complex represents for the ventricular contraction, and the T wave represents for the ventricular relaxation. Okay, so you can see that we can also have the PR interval is here. PR interval. Later we will mention it later. So what we have here, P wave represents atrium, QRS ventricle, T wave ventricular repolarization, and then RR we can help us to know the heart period, PR to see whether we have PR interval to see whether we have the AV block, okay, and etc. and etc. So what kind of information we can get from the ECG signal? Let's say in front of you, this graph is the normal ECG heartbeat. So if let's say we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 for normal heartbeat in this period of time, for the same period of time, right now we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 9. Definitely is heartbeat too fast. If right now if we have 1, 2, 3, 4, only 4, heartbeat too slow. But let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the same as the normal heartbeat, but the the rhythm sometimes is too fast, sometimes it's too slow. So what we can see that it is a weak irregular heartbeat. It's also have problem. So this is the reason why the ECG signal can let us know whether the heartbeat is too fast or too slow, or whether we have the myocardial infarction, whether we have fibrillation, etc. and etc. So you can see that, let's say, if this is the normal ECG signal, if we have the complete heart board, then we will have the signal look like this. If we have the AV block, then the PR interval will be lengthened. Okay. If we have how to say ectopic bit here, then we will have inverse signal here. If we see this one, tachycardia, that is tachycardia, and then this is the atrial flutter, and even the atrial fibrillation will look like this, or the ventricular fibrillations will look like this. So that is the reason why you can see that different ECG signal pattern will have different, how to say, diseases representation. So right now I would like you to have a look on ECG monitoring system. That is a 24-hour Holter monitoring system.
A Holter monitor is a small digital device that keeps track of your heart rate and rhythm for 24 hours. During that time, the device records all of your ECG, which is a record of the heart's electrical activity. When you come to Heart West for a Holter, a technician will take you to the Holter room. He or she will then place electrodes on your chest. Some hair may need to be shaved to make sure the electrodes stick properly. The electrodes are then connected to a recording device with several wires. You will be shown how to properly wear the recording device so that it can record data throughout the next 24 hours. You may also be instructed to press a particular button on the recording device when you feel any symptoms. Once your monitor is fitted, you can leave and resume your normal activities. You can hide the electrodes and wires under your clothes.
Okay, it's quite simple. Okay, in front of you, that is it. Actually, that if you still remember how many electrode has been attached onto the patient, normally it can only measure, let's say, maybe 6 leads only. For a ECG signal, it can be 12 leads. Okay, so that is a simple introduction on how we can use the ECG signals to monitor the health of the heart. So right now is also we also have a video to talk about how we can interpret the ECG signal. Of course, we will discuss it in the later my course lecture. But right now, just try to let you see the 6 steps for the ECG interpretation. Okay. So let me see.
What is going on, guys? Don checking in. Welcome to MIT, where we bring nursing to you. So today we're going to talk about the easiest way to do your EKG interpretation. So if you're a nursing student or a new nurse who wants to do your EKG faster, stick around. This video is for you.
Alright guys, this is the 6-step EKG interpretation. So before we talk about the actual steps, we're going to discuss important concepts that will help us have a better understanding of what's going on inside the heart as it generates a heartbeat. The first concept that we are going to discuss is the conduction system of the heart. Now the conduction system of the heart is pretty much these special cardiac cells right here that are responsible in conducting signals that cause the heart to contract. The first cell is called the SA node, right here, or the sinoatrial node. By its name, sinoatrial, this cell is found within the right atrium of the heart. This is also known as the natural pacemaker of the heart, because this is where the beginning of the conduction takes place. So from the SA node, the conduction goes to the AV node, or the atrioventricular node. By its name, this can be found within the border of the right atrium and the right ventricle. The AV node is also known as the gatekeeper of the heart, and the reason being is that it gets to decide what impulse to let through. So, If the SA node generates a weak impulse or there is a block here somewhere, the AV node will perceive that and will decide not to let the impulse go through, and instead it will conduct its own impulse. So from the AV node, it goes to the single structure right here called the bundle of His, and from the bundle of His, the cells will continue and will bifurcate into two separate cells, one to the left and one to the right, and this will now be called the left and right bundle branches. And from the bundle branches, they will extend within the apex of the heart. They will be called the Purkinje fibers. So again, the conduction system of the heart begins at the SA node, goes to the AV node, next is the bundle of His, the right and the left bundle branches, and then eventually Purkinje fibers. So another concept that we need to discuss will be the inherent rate of these cardiac cells. When you say inherent rates, these are pretty much the heart rate that we generate depending on which cardiac cell sends an impulse. So for example, if the SA node starts it all and it goes all the way to the Purkinje fibers, this will generate a heart rate of 60 to 100 beats per minute. It starts from here, goes all the way to the Purkinje fibers, that will generate a heart rate of 60 to 100 beats per minute. However, for some reason, if the SA node fails or there's a block somewhere here, then the AV node will kick in. It will generate its own impulse. And when this happens, the AV node will generate a heart rate of 40 to 60 beats per minute. And that also includes the bundle of His. The bundle of His also will generate its own impulse, and it's enough to make 40 to 60 beats per minute. And if the AV node or the bundle of His fail, then the left and the right bundle branches and the Purkinje fibers will generate their own impulse, and they have the capacity to make a heartbeat up to 20 to 40 beats per minute. So now, let us talk about EKG. It has different parts. We will start with this small bump right here called the P wave, followed by this tall structure right here called the QRS complex, and lastly, the last bump after the QRS complex would be the T wave. Let us discuss them one by one. Let's start off with P wave. The P wave represents atrial depolarization. During atrial depolarization, the two atria are contracting. Next up, the QRS complex. Now, the QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization. During ventricular depolarization, the ventricles of the heart are contracting. Depolarization is for contraction. So how would you know which one is which? That P wave is for atria, while QRS is to ventricles. So if you look at the diagram right here, the QRS complex, it kind of looks like an inverted V. So V for ventricles. So when you see a QRS complex, think about ventricular depolarization. So lastly, we have the T wave. The T wave represents ventricular repolarization. This is when the ventricles are relaxing. Keep in mind that every depolarization is always followed by repolarization. So for every contraction will be followed by relaxation. That being said, the question is, where is atrial repolarization? So if QRS represents ventricular depolarization or contraction, and T wave represents ventricular repolarization or relaxation, then where is atrial repolarization if this is depolarization? Well, it can be found within the QRS complex. As you can see, the QRS complex, it's a tall structure. Because ventricles tend to contract stronger than the atria, they tend to mask the atrial repolarization. And so, that being said, atrial repolarization and relaxation takes place after the P wave, which can be found within the QRS complex. Now, as a review, P wave stands for atrial depolarization. The QRS complex represents ventricular depolarization. The T wave represents ventricular repolarization, and the atrial repolarization is covered by the QRS complex. You can't see it, but it exists. So now let us talk about the segments and intervals in the EKG diagram. There are a bunch, starting off with the PR interval, the PR segment, the QRS complex, the ST segment, and the QT interval. But to make it easy for you guys, we are just going to talk about the PR interval and the QRS complex. These are all we need to do the EKG interpretation. The other segments, they are important too, but we don't really need them to interpret an EKG faster and more efficient. So this is your typical EKG strip. In an EKG strip, we have a big box. And inside a big box, we have 5 small boxes. Each small boxes is equal to 0.04 seconds. And so if in a big box there are 5 small boxes, that means that one big box is equal to 0.20 seconds. But really, as long as you know that one small box is 0.04 seconds, we're good to go. So let us get on with our 6-step EKG interpretation. First up, we have to identify and examine the P waves, measure the PR interval, measure the QRS complex, identify the rhythm, determine the heart rate, and interpret your strip. And we're going to talk about them one by one. Let's start off with identify and examine your P waves right here. The normal P wave would be present and upright. If the P wave is absent or inverted, then it could indicate a form of dysrhythmia such as a junctional rhythm. Next up, we are going to measure the PR interval. PR interval is the distance between the beginning of the P wave and the beginning of the QRS complex. What we do is we count the number of small boxes in between and multiply it by 0.04 seconds. Our magic number for the PR interval is 0.12 to 0.20 seconds. Anything more than 0.20 seconds could indicate another dysrhythmia such as heart blocks. Third would be to measure the QRS complex. Just like the PR interval, we are going to measure the small boxes in between the QRS complex. Our magic number is 0.06 to 0.12 seconds. Anything more than 0.12 could indicate a dysrhythmia such as a PVC. Number 4 is we have to identify the rhythm of our strip. It could be regular or irregular. And the way we do this is we measure the distance between R's. R's and R's. Some people use calipers to do this, but really all you need is an index card. Mark your R's and march them with the rest of the R's. If they have the same distance, then your rhythm is regular. Otherwise, they are irregular. Fifth step is when we identify our heart rate. Now, before we calculate our heart rate, it is very important for us to know that our EKG is a 6-second strip. And the way we will know this is when we find these 3 lines right over here. If you see these lines, this means that from the first line up to the third line, that would be your 6-second strip. The reason why this is important is that if it is a 6-second strip, then we can do a technique called the 6-second method. And the way we do this is that we count the number of R's between these 3 lines right here and multiply them by 10. So for this strip, we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and multiply that by 10. That will give us a heart rate of 60 beats per minute. One thing to remember is that this method works best for irregular rhythms. And another tip that I can tell you is that you have to be very, very careful in using the 6-second method. You always have to verify that the strip that you're reading is indeed a 6-second strip. I know some teachers include strips that appear to be 6-second strips, but they're really not. They don't have these 3 lines right here. And students actually mess up the heart rate because they use the 6-second method. This method only works for 6-second strips. Okay? Second method that we can use to calculate the heart rate is the big box method. And the way this works is that we divide 300 by the number of big boxes between 2 R's. Our magic number is 300. So for this strip, we are going to use these two R's right here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 big boxes in between R's. And so, using the formula, 300 divided by 5, we have 60 beats per minute. This method works better for regular rhythms only. And this is actually the method that you can use if you don't have a 6-second script in front of you. And the final step is interpret your script.
So that is it for today, guys. I hope you find that helpful. And if you haven't already, please hit the like and subscribe button and let us know in the comment section below.
Okay, so right now you know how to interpret your ECG signal. Of course, during my class, I'll also teach you how to interpret the ECG signal and what if the time for, let's say, the PR interval is longer than the normal time, what happens will be the heart. What is the problem? Okay, right now I will talk about the ERG, electroretinogram. So as we all know that we have a retina inside our eye, and when the light falls onto the retinas will generate the biopotential signal, and that kind of biopotential signal will pass through the optic nerve and go into our brain, and then once it reaches the brain, it will try to interpret to form the image. Okay, so how we can measure it, of course, is so simple. Try to using a contact lens with some circuitry, then try to capture the biopotential out. So normally we all have this kind of pattern. We will have the A, B, C, D, these four characteristic points. Okay, so we will discuss it later in my classes. Okay, so the second component normally we will have a latency of about 1 to 5 milliseconds, and then which is the late receptor potential, which have been found to be maximum near the synaptic ending of the photoreceptor, and therefore we fetch the output of the receptors. Okay, this is not that important, and then right now I'll try to teach you how to measure the ERG signal. So you can see that she put a wire rather than a contact lens. So sometimes you may think that it's quite scary to measure the ERG. Okay, so I think that's maybe enough for all of you, and then so try to give the stimulant, and then you will see the signal. Okay, you will see the signal. You see here. Do you see? It looks like this. Okay, just look like the shape like this. Okay, after we have stimulus. So right now I will talk about the EOG, electrocardiograph. So we can say that EOG actually is to measure the eye muscle, the biopotential of the eye muscle. As we all know that the eye is held in positions by 6 muscles. Okay, so when this 6 muscle is moving, then we have the EOG signal. So how we can use it, and then try to use it to measure whether how to say, we have good sleeping. The sleeping quality, we can use things like EOG because as we all know that when people is going to deep sleep, we have the rapid eye movement sleeping. So once our eye is moving, then it means that we fall into the rapid eye movement sleeping. That means that we have good sleep and we can count how many times, etc., etc. Other than that, we still have a lot of applications. So how we can use the EOG? For example, we can use it to control a wheelchair, to have some remote control. So right now, let us have a look on how these guys to use the EOG signals to wirelessly remote controls the wheelchair or this motor car, this remote car. Okay.
Start. Up.
So you see when he say up and his eye move up, the car move up.
Right. Left. Up. Down.
Okay.
Right.
So I think that's all. That is enough for us to know how we can use the EOGs to control the wheelchair. So right now I will talk about the EEG signal. EEG signal. So as I mentioned before, EEG have no repeated pattern, regular pattern. Okay, so but only some diseases they have the distinct pattern. For example, the epilepsy. If we try to measure the EEG, if we try to remove the skull bone and measure the EEG directly on the surface of the brain, the signal is quite high, 10 millivoltage, but it's invasive. No people want to do it. There is a reason why we will try to measure the EEG signal from the scalp. So the amplitude of the EEG signal will dramatically drop to 100 microvoltage, and the frequency of the EEG signal normally is with the bandwidth of 0.5 Hz up to 100 Hz. So before we start, we just simply know a little bit about the anatomy of our brain. So let's say we have the cerebellum, etc., etc. No need to know. This is not that important. The most important is here. So here is the frontal part. Here is the back of our brain. Left-hand side and right-hand side. You will see this region is for vision. That is the reason why when we fall down and our head is hit onto the ground, we can't see, or even we will have black screen. Okay, here is the sensory area, here is the motor area, and here is the hearing. So there is the reason why when some people give a slap or a hand onto the people's face near to the ear, they may lose their hearing, temporarily or permanently. So it's because the hearing region is here. So right now I need to say there are 4 different types of the normal ECG signal. We have the alpha band, beta, theta, and delta. For the alpha, it has the bandwidth of 8 to 13 Hz. Beta is with the frequency bandwidth of 14 to 30, and the theta is 4 to 7 Hz, and the delta is below 3.5 Hz. So they will have different kinds of shape here. So it's quite interesting when for the EEG signal, let's say when we try when our eye is open, it will look like this, but the EEG signal will look like this. But when our eye is closed, the EEG signals will look like this. So when we are excited, our EEG signal will look like this. But when we are relaxed, the EEG signal the signals will become larger and wider. So when we are drowsy, the signal will look like this, asleep will look like this, and deep sleep will look like this. That is the reason why the EEG signal can help us to know the sleeping quality of our sleep. So not just the EOG signal, but also the EEG signal, which can help the medical physicians to, to evaluate the sleeping quality of a patient. So as I mentioned before, there are some diseases which have the distinct EEG signal, that is the epilepsy. So this is the distinct pattern of the epilepsy. Okay. So we have 10, 20 electrode system. We try to, let's say, here, if here is the length of the distance, we try to, let's say, 0% of the length, 10% of the length, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, and finally 10% of the length. In total is 100%. So at all this kind of position, 10, 20, 20, 20, 20, 10, we put the electrode on that position, because different people will have different skull size. How we can know we put the electrode at the corresponding position is by scale. That is why we have a trend 10, 20 from the frontal to from the front part to the from front to the back, from lateral to from left to right, the same. Okay. So right now, I will let you to have a look on how we use the EEG signal for epilepsy.
What is going on, guys? Don checking in. Well,
Video EEG monitoring is a system that allows simultaneous EEG and video monitoring for patients. This service will provide precise monitoring and correlation between patients' seizures and brainwave seizure activities. My name is Dr. Firas Petinjani. I'm a neurologist and epileptologist with Neurology Specialist and DePaul Beyond Secure Medical Center. Video EEG monitoring is usually performed in a fixed video EEG unit, where patients will be having the EEG recording and the video signal will be digitized.
You'll find that
and
when we try to put the
and both
electrode
the EEG and video will be displayed
onto the scalp, we need to use the conduction gel, which is very sticky.
In a review station for the epileptologist to review. The process for patients to be benefiting from the epilepsy monitoring unit is first they will be evaluated by an epileptologist. Those are usually patients that have seen several neurologists treated with different medications and they're not seizure-free yet. First, we need to make sure they do have epilepsy, because some patients, they have non-epileptic seizures, and then if their seizures are under poor control, they will need to capture one of their seizures on their video EEG monitoring, and that will be the first crucial step to evaluate them for epilepsy surgery. Also, capturing their seizures on this system will help us to decide what type of seizures they have, and we can determine precisely what medication best is for their epilepsy syndrome. Our goal is to have patients seizure-free and not just reasonably controlled.
Okay, you see, medical physicians also need to use the EEG signals to document or to evaluate the epilepsy. Okay, so that is the applications of one of the applications for the EEG signal. So that's all for today's lecture. I hope all of you can understand what you have learned in today's lecture. In the first sessions, we learned why our body cell can generate the biopotential signal. On the second session, we'll try to talk about how we apply the biopotential signals on medical on medicine, on medical application. So that's all for today's lecture, and see you all. Oh, not see you all. Not see you all on next week.